John Lennon thought about his life a lot when he was older. He remembered all the things that had happened to him and how they made him the person he was. But there was one thing that really stood out: the day he met Paul McCartney. This was a time before they became famous, and their lives got really crazy and sad. When John Lennon met Paul McCartney, it was a normal meeting, but it changed music forever. This meeting happened on July 6, 1957, on an ordinary summer day in Liverpool, England. John Lennon and Paul McCartney meeting was a deal. The day John Lennon met Paul McCartney was the start of something. John was 16 years old. He had a lot of sadness and anger inside him because his mother, Julia, had passed away. Music was the one thing that helped him feel better and kept him safe. That day John was playing music with the Quarrymen at a church event in Woolton. The event was not fancy, it was just a simple get-together with families, people laughing, and selling things they made at home. Something big was happening there. Nobody knew it yet. John and the Quarrymen were just playing music. It was the start of something important. Music was a part of John's life, and it was helping him to deal with the loss of his mother, Julia. There was a boy in the crowd. He was 15 years old. His name was Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney had gone through a time too, just like John. Paul McCartney lost his mother, Mary. That was very hard for him. So Paul McCartney found comfort in music. Paul McCartney watched John closely when he was performing. He saw how confident John was. He liked his rough charm and how funny he was. John was not perfect when he was on stage. Paul McCartney thought he was really good at getting people to pay attention to him. When the performance was over, someone named Ivan Vaughan introduced Paul McCartney to John. This is a moment that people will remember for a time. Paul got a guitar, started playing. He tuned it fast, and then he played Eddie Cochran's song 20 Flight Rock. He played it perfectly. John was really impressed. At the same time, he felt a little bad. Paul was better at music than John in some ways. John knew this away. There was something more that connected Paul and John. They started talking about music and guitars and American rock and roll. At the time, they both knew something was hurting them deep down. They did not need to talk about it. Paul and John just understood each other. These two guys were young, had to grow up without their mothers. They were trying to find their way in a world that was really tough. Music was something they both understood. They did not become friends away, but they knew they had something in common. John saw that Paul was very good at music and worked hard at it, while Paul saw that John was a person and a good leader. John and Paul each had things that the other did not have. That is what made their relationship interesting. Music was the thing that brought John and Paul together. John asked Paul to join the Quarrymen after a week's. This was a decision for John because he was not sure what would happen. John was worried that he would not be in charge of the band anymore. John also knew that you have to try new things if you want to be really good at something. When John and Paul started writing songs, something really cool happened. John and Paul wrote songs in ways, but it worked out well. John liked to write about how he felt and be honest. Paul liked to make sure the songs sounded good and had a rhythm. Of arguing about this, John and Paul used their differences to make their songs better. John and Paul kept writing songs, and the Quarrymen started to sound really good. The Quarrymen were always competing with each other, trying to be better than each other. This really helped the Quarrymen to get better over time. The Quarrymen changed a lot. George Harrison joined the Quarrymen. Then Ringo Starr joined the Quarrymen. By 1960, the Quarrymen were called the Beatles. The Beatles became very popular quickly. The Beatles started playing in clubs in Hamburg, and then the Beatles were playing sold-out shows all around the world. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the people in the Beatles. These people were more than musicians who played together in a band. They were friends who worked together to create music. They wrote songs that a lot of people loved and that helped create the kind of music we listen to today. The songs they wrote are really important because they defined what music was like for a group of people, and they helped shape the music we have now. They were partners, and that is what made their music so special. The music of these bandmates is still popular today because they were able to write songs that meant something to a lot of people. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were getting really popular. They used to write songs at night and play in clubs. Then the Beatles became huge, and the whole world was talking about them. The Beatles were not a band anymore, they were something much bigger. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the ones who made it all happen. They worked together, wrote songs about being young, feeling hopeful, being in love and feeling confused. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were writing about what they were going through with all the fame that was coming their way fast. The way they wrote songs was really intense and personal. They would sit together with their guitars, facing each other, and finish each other's lines. One of them would start with an idea that was not complete, and the other would make it better, pointing out the parts and making the good parts stronger. John brought a lot of edge and emotional honesty and sharpness to the songs. Paul brought melody and balance and harmony to the songs. When they put all these things together, the songs sounded easy to make. That was not the case, because they put in a lot of work to make the song sound that way. The Beatles came up with songs like She Loves You, All My Loving, and A Hard Day's Night when they were working together. They were in this place where they helped each other and also tried to do than each other. The Beatles songs like She Loves You and All My Loving and A Hard Day's Night are really examples of what happened when the Beatles worked together like this. Fame changed everything for the Beatles. The year was 1963. Beatlemania was everywhere. When the Beatles performed, the crowd screamed loudly that the Beatles could hardly hear the music they were playing. The Beatles, John and Paul, became famous all around the world. Fans, reporters, and people who had expectations were always following the Beatles. The Beatles were always traveling, so they had to live in hotel rooms and on tour buses. Even though the Beatles looked happy and successful to the public, the Beatles were under a lot of pressure behind the scenes. John was not very sure of himself, so he made jokes, tried to be funny to hide how he really felt. Paul worked hard to keep the band on track. He practiced all the time, made sure the music sounded good. Paul and John were different. They still trusted each other when it came to music. John said that Paul helped him finish songs when he wanted to give up. Paul said that John told him the truth, which kept him from doing the things over and over. Paul and John helped each other make their music better. They looked at each other's ideas, made them stronger. Paul and John got rid of the parts and kept the good parts. This way, Paul and John made sure their music was the best it could be. The Beatles' music changed as they got older. They made some good albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver. These albums showed that the band was trying things. John started writing about who he was, feeling lonely. He also thought about his life and who he wanted to be. Paul liked to tell stories with his songs and try kinds of music. Even though John and Paul were writing kinds of songs, they still said they wrote them together as Lennon McCartney. This showed that they were still a team. Underneath, things were not going well. The Beatles were touring all the time. It was making them very tired. John felt like he was stuck being a Beatle, did not know who he was outside of the band. Paul was really scared that the group would not come up with ideas. So he worked harder to keep the Beatles moving forward. The friendship between Paul and the other guys in the band lasted. They went through things that only they could understand. Being in the Beatles was an experience that only Paul and the other three guys knew about. Being part of the songwriting team of Lennon and McCartney was something that only John and Paul knew about. This special connection between John and Paul made their friendship stronger. At the same time, it also made it inevitable that they would disagree with each other. The Beatles had a relationship by the mid-1960s, but it was not easy anymore. They were very tired. They were not sure about what they were doing. The Beatles were excited when they first started. Now, they were exhausted. When the Beatles stopped playing shows in 1966, they were relieved. The crowds were screaming much, and it was hard to hear themselves play. The studio was where the Beatles worked now. John started writing songs that were more about his life, like Help, Strawberry Fields Forever. These songs were sometimes sad. John wanted to be able to do what he wanted and write the songs he wanted to write. The Beatles, especially John, wanted to be free to make their music. Paul was really getting into making music with a lot of structure and trying things. He thought of the studio like an instrument and made really detailed songs like Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby. At first, the way Paul and the others worked together made their music better. You can hear this on the album Revolver, where all their different styles come together. This worked well on the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band that came out in 1967. Paul had a lot of ideas for this project. John wrote some great songs too, even if he did not feel as connected to the whole idea of the album. The death of manager Brian Epstein that year was really bad for the Beatles. Brian Epstein had been a help to the band. He kept them safe from people outside the band who were trying to tell them what to do. When he died, the Beatles did not know how to take care of themselves. John was not sure what the band should do next. When the band had meetings, they would often end up arguing. The trust that they had was gone. The personal problems that John Lennon and Paul McCartney were having made it hard for them to work together. The Beatles, including John Lennon and Paul McCartney, were having a time. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were struggling to work with each other. When Paul released his solo album in 1970 and said publicly that the Beatles were done, John was really upset. He thought Paul was trying to be in charge of what people thought about the Beatles' breakup. Paul and John were both very hurt by what happened. The Beatles' ending was a deal. It was the end of a big part of music history. Even though the Beatles were not together anymore, Paul and John still had a lot of issues with each other. People found out about their problems when they gave interviews, released albums, and were in the news. All of this showed that the Beatles and what they did together still meant a lot to Paul and John. In the 1970s, the Beatles' unresolved emotions started to come out in their music. Paul made an album called Ram in 1971. It had some subtle expressions of frustration in it, especially in the song Too Many People. This song was really about how Paul felt about John and Yoko Ono. John did not hold back, responded with his own album called Imagine. The main song on the album was about peace, but another song called How Do You Sleep was a pretty harsh attack on Paul. The Beatles were fighting in public. It was a big shock to their fans. George Harrison even helped with the recording. Ringo Starr did not like the conflict between the Beatles and felt uncomfortable. The Beatles' music was showing how they really felt about each other. John later said that the song came from feeling insecure and resentful. Paul felt bad about it. He was sad rather than angry. When Paul was with Wings, he wrote a song called Friend. This song was like a message asking if his friendship with John was really over. Even though John never said anything about it in public, the people who knew him well thought that the song really got to John. During this time, both men struggled to redefine themselves as individuals. John wanted to prove he was more than half of a legendary partnership, while Paul sought to move forward creatively. Yet the shadow of the Beatles followed them everywhere, and the silence between them remained filled with unspoken words.